So welcome to this special panel on tariff wars and trade-offs. Can India and China find common grounds? It is my pleasure to chair this session on a topic which has great contemporary relevance. As we all know, India and China have been among the most affected economies because of the upheaval that has started because of the Trump tariffs. In addition, the economic and diplomatic ties between these two Asian giants have also been frosty, although there are some signs of thaw in recent times. So we couldn't have asked for a more relevant topic for the current times. We have four very distinguished gentlemen to enlighten us on this topic. Let me briefly introduce each of them as well as the topics of their talks today. Our first speaker is Professor Murali K. Professor Murali is Professor and Head of Administration at the Center for WTO Studies, Indian Institute of Foreign Trade, New Delhi. Today, he will be talking to us about data gaps in international trade, a structural perspective. Our second speaker is Dr. Rajan Sudesh Ratna. Dr. Ratna is Deputy Head and Senior Economic Affairs Officer at the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, ESCAP, South and Southwest Asia Office. Today, Dr. Ratna will be talking to us on India-China economic cooperation, reshaping the South-South trade. Our third speaker is Mr. Santosh Pai. Mr. Pai is partner with Legal Link, and he is an honorary fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. Mr. Pai's talk today is on recalibration of economic ties with China. What, why, and how. Our fourth speaker is Professor 𝐓𝐴rvind 𝐖𝐴rvind. Professor 𝐓𝐴rvind is Associate Professor at the Center for East Asian Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and an honorary fellow, Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. Professor 𝐓𝐴rvind is also, of course, the co-convenor of this conference. His talk today is titled Turning Tariffs into Opportunity, India at the Crossroads of Trade and Investment Flows. Please join me in welcoming them all to the panel. And like all of you, I'm looking forward to this exciting lineup of talks. So we have structured this discussion as follows. We will first have each of these speakers talk to us for about 8 to 10 minutes. I will then summarize their talk and we'll engage in a few discussion points that emerge from their talks. We will then open it up for the audience for Q&A. Without further ado, let me request Professor Murali to start the proceedings with this talk. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me here. I am Indore and Venkat, specifically you, and my dear friends. See, what I was trying to speak on a completely different topic, but after hearing that, and after seeing that, a lot of you are young people here, starting off your journey. So I thought, to talk about an issue which is quite alarming, but it's not well known. This is an issue of data gaps. It's a structural issue which is actually has been prevailing in the international arena for quite some time. It is largely out of the WTO's formation. Whatever was agreed was not followed through by many countries, and we are a victim of it. And this is being reflected in the international discourse, which culminated in Trump imposing for 54 countries some additional duty of 10%, and then he went on 25, and we are facing the 50% duty. So why did he do it? He had this. The US faced this issue, and US has been trying to convince the world and many of the countries, but they were singing their own songs. And why it came up as an issue was because we all have concerns and to protect our domestic industry. And India has been doing pretty well in terms of protecting it because we kept tariffs very high, and since we couldn't apply the non-tariff measure, which is the other side of market access, there are two issues in market access. When you are accessing a country, you have a tariff, then you have a non-tariff measure, which is not mentioned in terms of HS codes. So when you apply a scenario of liberalization, you talk in terms of both. Either you harmonize the regulations, or you have signed an MRA, mutual recognition agreement, that my standard is your standard is my standard. So that sort of an agreement, if you have, then you can say, if you're reducing a tariff, you have a liberal market access scenario. Now the issue is quite complex in the international trade scenario, because this is 166 countries negotiating with each other and under the WTO umbrella. And since Trump has imposed a tariff of 50%, and for 54 countries he has reciprocal tariff has been applied, he has breached the bound scenario. Because this is quite technical, let's understand it. He has actually gone out of WTO. Now, once I say this, we have a tariff which is measured and which can be applied on each HS codes. HS codes, because it's a product code which we apply in terms of international commerce when commodities cross borders. Now, this sort of a scenario gets complicated when you don't have a ad valorem terms codes which is actually mentioned in ad valorem terms. What I mean by ad valorem terms is 15%. If you say it's a HS code 1% code as a tariff, you can read it and measure it. But then the moment you say it is X rupees for so many kgs or 1 kg, then it is very difficult for you to measure and quantify. That's one problem which has not been addressed particularly in agriculture. Now, if not at this, it becomes a major non-transparent tariff which has not been reflected in the narratives on a daily basis. So whenever you hear European Union tariff is 3.6, it is not actually 3.6, it is 36.4 when you convert the non-ad valorem equivalent tariffs. So that is the kind of narrative building what happens at the international level. We have been blamed unnecessarily for high tariffs, but whereas some of these countries have been maintaining high tariffs. So this US also has been saying these issues, both the countries have been negotiating and they have not come to an agreement. That said, there are other imbalances in trade, which is actually service sector data is not captured fully, except for 12 broad lines. There are 166 tariff services data. Not all subsector level data is there, captured. Why? Because cross-country level data is very difficult to get. See, only RBI can give you, or central banks can give you data on service flows. Other than that, you cannot get data at the customs. The other aspect is digital trade, which is actually growing in volume and value. Now, digital trade just doesn't take the normal trade commerce route. It doesn't come to the port, doesn't get recorded and registered at the port, so it misses the registration as trade data. Now, when it becomes important, why it becomes important is, when you have certain products digitized, they actually miss the customs and they come and get registered in bank payment gateways. So you actually cross-border enter and then you get registered, recorded in bank payment gateways. Now it is getting registered at the RBI when it's entering the country. But see, an agreement between the customs, a proper robust data could be an agreement between the customs and the central bank to share data. If that agreement is established, we have a UPI in India, somewhat we are capturing, but the establishment of link between these two organizations has to be concretized and established. Once you do that, then you have a proper record of commerce. The other problem what I see is, in trade governance is largely public sector, which has been maintaining data for the last couple of decades, is stopped doing that. Because you can see that, in India also, last census was, when did we have our last census? Some 12 years, 15 years ago? We didn't have any other census after that. All that has moved to the private sector. The argument there is, private sector is much more methodologically stronger and public sector data is weak in terms of methodology. But that's I feel, that's a humbug argument, because public sector is for collecting data and it is up to us as an academician to make it robust by applying various techniques and analytical tools. So what is happening is public good is becoming private good. Now, when that happens, profit motive enter the debate. When profit enters, you only focus on certain groups of people in surveys. So when we are using data, such data, and recent data, we should be mindful that this sort of a bias may enter your analysis. It's also true with one of the important aspects like SPS measure, which is an MRL measure, which is sanitary and phytosanitary measure. It's a non-tariff measure. It's a technical non-tariff measure, which again, one of the barriers at the border. Now what has happened is, till about 2015, global MRL data was maintained by US authorities. That was shifted to Brain and Christie. Now when that shift happens, it didn't happen, naturally. It was actually forced to be given. Why was it forced to be given? It's a completely different debate. Now, when that happened, now suddenly the data became very costly. 10 countries, 10 products, $9,000. That is the amount which we have to share out. Imagine a small firm trying to find out what is the MRL restriction for an agriculture product or a commodity which they are exporting. It's really impossible for that particular firm or country to. If it's a small country, you're finished. The other thing which actually Ambassador also spoke about overcapacities. Now why is it happening around the world? It's happening because we are all using consultancy firms. And these consultancy firms, again going back to the profit motive argument, are not adjusting to the already recorded, factored predictions for one particular company. So it's also a big competition in driving excess capacities. Now, when we have all these problems and legacy model takes into account, what is thrown out is completely bogus. So I can give an example like, trade facilitation would yield to 1.3 billion trillion gains that was projected by one of the firms, one of the institutions. Did that happen? Did we record it? No, we don't know what is a trade facilitation. Ultimately, how did it end up facilitating trade? When we are talking about exports, we are talking about producer welfare. When you are talking about imports, we are talking about consumer welfare. So when you are talking about overall welfare of a country, we should have both. But most often, models use only import. So we are only talking about consumer welfare and not about producer welfare. I think that is what fundamentally the problem is. When the countries have gone back to the producers and they're talking about national concerns and national manufacturing policy, they want to say that, for long we have addressed consumer welfare, but let's also address producer welfare. Now, a balanced approach would be always good. I think we should have both. So let me stop my talk here and I'll get back to you in the second round. Yeah, thank you for this one.
Thank you, Professor Modi. I now request Dr. Ratnam to start.
Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I will thank IIM host and Venkat for giving us this opportunity to participate. I know in the panel, generally presentations are not allowed, it's not desired, but no script, it's just to show you some figures. Modi talked about data, so no, it's not working. Yeah, okay. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. So this only indicates the tariffs when it was initially announced in April and then on 31st of July. So red one, you can see India is at a disadvantage. Many of the countries in Southwest Asia where we are working are all on advantage except Nepal, Maldives, Iran and Bhutan, which is 10% duties. Using the data and partial equilibrium model, we worked at the two scenarios. If the duty of US increased for 10% and then 20 percentage point, and you can see the biggest loser in the US market is China, obviously, that's imperative. And in our region, India is the one which is the highest impacted in terms of losing the market to US because of these tariffs. And if you see, we did another simulation looking into India when the 50% has been announced. This is done quickly. And there are a lot of discussions going on which sector will be impacted and how. So this is the model just gives you, and just to illustrate that which sectors would be impacted most in terms of export. Of course, this is with a caveat that this is on a partial equilibrium model, and it doesn't take into account the differential duties which US has charged on other countries. And also in some of these HS nomenclature like 71, which is natural cultural pearls, there are many exemptions by US. It also looks into pharmaceutical, where now the duties have been increased furthermore. And Trump announced he will also go to 50% duty, but at one point of time, pharmaceuticals were exempted from these reciprocal duties, some of the lines. So definitely two countries from Asia and Pacific, India and China, are going to be hit hard. China is not negotiating any BTA with US, India is. And the other thing which is worrying and which we all know is the growing adverse balance of trade of India with China. If one looks at into welfare, import welfare and producer welfare, perhaps India may not be that much loser because you are importing cheap product from China than it could be sourced from anywhere else. So overall net balance of trade with the world will be lesser. But what is worrisome is this. If you see over the years what China has been exporting to India in 2010 and 2014, you will find that they have graduated from exporting raw material and intermediate product to the consumer goods and capital goods, which are high-end items. But if you see India's composition of exports, or you can see India's export to China, and then you will see that India has been doing mostly these imports are basically China's import from India, and export is China's export from to India. So import of China in 2010 from India was no, sorry, it's India. Sorry, I'm wrong. It's India's export and import. So if you see India export, intermediate product and raw material constitute more than 70% in 2010, which is now around 65% in 2024. But imports, if you see, from China, raw material were not much, 2%, but intermediate goods were 35, which has gone down to 28. But the capital goods from 51 to 61. So over 10% of the total import from China has increased in capital goods, which is very machinery, electronics, high value added item. And if you import a high value added item, definitely you pay more in terms of the dollar. But when you are exporting raw material, the price is less. So the composition or a structural imbalance in export and import between India and China is the main root for this balance of trade. And what was talked in the opening session, Ambassador told about overproduction in China, there is also underproduction in India, whatever we may say, or whatever we may aim for 2030, 2047. And that can be demonstrated that if you really want to grab or fill this gap of $100 billion to China, it is simply possible because I analyzed top 15 sectors which China was globally importing was $1.18 trillion worth. And out of that $1.18 trillion, India's export to China was only $7.65 billion. And India's total exports to the world is only $215 billion. So see what is the trade gap, even in 15 sector. A country can import 1.18 trillion from the world, and we have only the capacity to export to the world $250 million. There is a tremendous scope of enhancing the production to mitigate the balance of trade if India wants it. So what do we need to do? I'm coming to the point on Global South. It is a fact that India and China are two very important players in the world now for surviving of the Global South. And this was demonstrated long ago in 2007-8 when Goldman Sachs created a problem, went into problem, and US, and followed by that, EU went into a recession. But the countries in Asia and Pacific, though were dependent on their economy on external trade, their economy survived. It didn't go that bad as the countries in Latin America and Africa were. It was only because of import power of India and China at that moment of time. So India and China were importing during that period of time huge, and there is a lot of report which has been written, including ESCAP report, as to how India and China came out for the survival of the many of the Asia Pacific countries, especially developing countries. The three dimensions which we need to look into, which I would just point out. One is political. The political differences between India and China conflict are known, so is known with your neighboring countries. But if we look at the history of Europe, if we look at the history of ASEAN, they had border disputes, they still have border disputes. But it is because of the economic integration and the vested interest between the sides of the businessmen that these political conflicts have been kept on back burner. India-China, including even at one point of time, Honorable Prime Minister Modi said, when this conflict happened, that not a single bullet has been fired at the India-China border, which itself speaks very high given the large boundary which India and China have. There would be conflicts, there could be border disputes, but it can be controlled if both sides show maturity. The second is economic. We have seen the economic integration or connectivity between India and China is already there, while China is importing a lot of raw material and intermediate goods from India, which we are part of China's larger supply chain, but at a lower end, whereas China is also part of India's supply chain, but at a higher end. And therefore, if there could be a good mix and match which can happen, it could be a win-win situation for both the countries. And if there are very strong economic interests, definitely neither China nor India would like to get into any conflicting situation among themselves, learning from those lessons of what I said in Europe and ASEAN. India-China, if cooperation can happen, it can be one solution to this multipolar, or I say now it's a unipolar world, because in the international trade it's only what US is the one which decides. So there is no multipolar, bipolar world today, it's a unipolar world today. The WTO agenda for the last 6 years has been hijacked by a single country, which is US. Many countries are towing the line of having a BTA only to US, despite fact that the free trade agreements are supposed to have legally, in terms of Article 24 of GATT, a zero duty eliminated on substantial all trade, but all these countries are agreeing for 15 to 20% reciprocal duties. So the MFN duty of US, which is 3 to 5%, becomes zero, but the effective duty of exporting to US continues by 15% or 20%, which is 5 to 7 times more than which was before Trump. How can countries accept that? So it's a unipolar world. Now, we have seen the statement after BRICS and after SCO. And actually after SCO, it shows some vulnerability to US. Because they showed the concern of India, China and Russia collaboration. So if we need to really balance the ecosystem in the world, the countries will have to cooperate and collaborate with each other, and especially India and China, politically, economically, for sure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ratna. I would now request Mr. Pai to deliver his talk.
Thank you. Thank you to IM for hosting this annual conference here. And thank you to Venkat and others who have put it together. I wear many hats, so I'll use my ICS hat today to, hope that this will be the beginning of a, deep interest for students here in IM in China studies. I think the gap in China studies, especially in business schools, is very telling. When it comes to industry, there's a lack of capacity. So I hope this conference covers some distance in that direction and encourages more and more students to look at China-related aspects in whatever discipline they're studying. I'll use my 10 minutes to just address two of the three questions, which is what and why, and how we will take it up during discussion. The what of India-China economic ties, I recently realized 3 months ago when I published a paper that there's very little awareness of each component of economic ties. People are normally following the trade figures which come in headlines, or maybe some investments that happened in startups. So the what is actually more, it's broken up into many more components. So trade, of course, I think my fellow panelists have gone to great lengths to explain how the dynamic structural imbalances that there are. We have a huge trade deficit now, nearer to 150 billion. And the composition is now mostly high value items, which is of great concern. Then there used to be investment between India and China, which touched, I think, around 10 billion. If you put together direct, indirect, digital economy, startups, manufacturing, everything together. There was also a large public procurement piece, which I think is the least well known. Which includes import of public goods and also execution of large EPC contracts, which are in steel, mining, power plants, and so on. And lastly, there was the digital part of it, which was the internet applications, which are not really investments, but they're just Chinese operated applications. So this was the kind of relationship we had on the economic side with China. So I think for students, earlier today we had a wonderful case study of Indian company OYO going to China and how it succeeded initially and then failed. So if students want to pick up some threads in the economic engagement with China on the Indian side, you will find a lot of case studies. I think Indore itself is home to a large factory from one of the heavy moving equipment manufacturer from China. So you can pick up many such case studies of Chinese companies having set up not very large but smallish factories trying to expand in the Indian market, failing, struggling, pivoting, trying different things and so on. Now in 2020 what happened was that we had the border incursions. Before that we had the pandemic, and Indian government decided to establish a FDI screening mechanism. And I've said this many times, I think India was very, very late to this trend of establishing a screening mechanism. So that was implemented a few weeks before Galwan, and it continues till date. And effectively the screening mechanism became a prohibition because the approval rate is about 15%, which is very low considering the amount of applications that were received. So today we are in a state where Chinese investments don't come freely into the country, they're highly regulated. And within a few months we banned digital apps. I think this has been very well publicized. We banned TikTok and 200, 300 other internet applications, and that became a big pain point for those companies because their international footprint took a severe beating, because India is a large market. After China, it's the largest consumption of digital applications. So that was a big hit. On the public procurement side, we set up a registration mechanism from DPIIT saying no matter whether you supply a small electronic goods or a big piece of machinery or any contract, you have to obtain prior registration. Again, that's more or less brought activities to a standstill. So today Indian bidders are participating in these public procurement contracts and indirectly procuring from China. So this is the picture I wanted to paint before getting into why do we need to recalibrate this relationship now. Last year in October, I think both leaders had a discussion which led to a feeling that the border issue is now not settled, not resolved, but it has reached a level where we can start talking about other things. And there's an expectation even now, 1 year down the line, that something will happen. And in the morning we heard from Ambassador about people-to-people interaction and so on. On the economic side, we haven't seen any significant progress. Selectively, some joint ventures are being approved and so on. And why do we need this recalibration? So this is where I want to zoom out, because I think the next couple of months we will see the EU FTA, the US trade deal if it happens, and various other FTAs that India has been signing up. Now, a large part of success of these other bilateral arrangements is dependent on China, on us fixing the China piece. Because let's take the EU FTA for example. A big part of it is defense. Everyone knows European countries, NATO countries are going to increase their defense spending to 3%, plus 1.5%. So that vast amount of capital which comes into manufacturing will have to be done in a trusted country. India is number one choice. There's no doubt about it. They won't go to China. That is something that will happen. But when you talk about other goods like consumer goods and other daily products that Europeans or Americans or anyone else consumes, now those companies, even if they sign FTA with India, they don't themselves have the capacity to manufacture. If you ask a German company to come to India and set up a factory, they'll say, no, sorry, we stopped doing that 20 years ago. We have been buying from China. So they have a long tail of suppliers sitting in China. So that's why I keep saying that no matter how many FTAs India does, there is a China component there which will make or break the success of that FTA beyond a certain point. And this is how supply chains work. You just Google randomly about any sector supply chain and it will give you a concentration number in China. It is 60%, 70%, 80%, somewhere around 50% at least. There are very few supply chains where China doesn't have at least 50 to 60% share. So now that is the reason why there's a sense of urgency amongst Indian industry to get their act together and at least get some technology from China, machinery from China, or sort out this kind of a partnership. It's not a partnership because it's not in a positive way, but it's de facto we are in this relationship of dependency and we have to deal with it. That is the sense of urgency. And if you have to boost exports, coming back to your point, this is the place where we move the needle. If we continue importing finished goods from China, and the Ministry of Commerce has tried in many sectors like toys and so on to establish standards and brought it down. But this capital goods, HS code 85, is very difficult to move. You cannot impose quality norms, you cannot ban imports, because then manufacturing sector in India will come to a standstill. And that's a cause of worry. So if any Indian company wants to localize those manufacturing activities in India, they will need Chinese support. So this is one source I have flagged, which is India's export potential, domestic manufacturing potential. Now there is another layer of complexity. In the last 10 years, we have issued passports to companies, we have issued passports to trade flows, we have issued passports to capital. We have now also issued passports to technology flows. So China has very confidently erected a massive bureaucracy to control flow of outbound flows of technology. And this is just the beginning. If you see the amount of investment they have made on the bureaucracy side, I think we will go far beyond rare earths and critical minerals. They will weaponize anything and everything. And that is one more imperative which we have to prepare for. We have to think forward 5 years, 10 years down the line, because we have a lot of dependency in a number of sectors. And critical earths and rare earths are critical for US, and maybe we will find some substitutes. Indian companies are now working day and night to find other options for magnets and so on. But our dependency is quite significant. So this is the other urgency that we need to remedy and reduce dependency on China. So I'll stop here by saying that there are a number of reasons why we need some kind of a serious dialogue. I think our finance minister and commerce minister both have come on record saying we need a serious talk with China. But we haven't figured out what is the de-escalation path after 5 years of political stalemate. Where do we start? What do they want? What do we want? How do we prioritize? What do we trade off? What do we negotiate? Can we have a partnership, or do we just, work in silos and we reduce our dependencies and they try to weaponize everything? So these are some of the questions, and I'm happy to join the conversation later. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Santosh. I will now request Professor Arvind to please talk.
Thank you, Chair. I think, 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 I think,
the ground has been cleared. I don't have anything much to say, but since I'm going to come with a case, and this case, I think I did not design Deva, sorry. Deva is going to cover about automobile sector, and his session was soon after this session, but since this case is included in my presentation, I'm going to take about automobile sector. I just skipped the first part of my presentation. I wanted to contextualize how, the globalization is not static, and it is mere reflection of function of power structure, technologies, and ideologies. So what happens when we talk about globalization and transition of globalization? At present, what we see is the fragmented and plural globalizations. Okay, what does it mean is essentially that there are more than one interpretation of globalization. It is not about the top to down globalization, but also the globalization horizontal and vertically spreading across the continents. And there are different actors and different variables of this globalization. We take two examples over here. One by the Alan Wolf, who was the Deputy Director General of WTO, who also agrees that the global trade has come to an inflection point. And when he says that inflection point, he's asserting that the technological change, rising nationalism, erosion of trust, and declining certainty in trade are the ones which are ruling the trade's equations. So trade is not becoming transactional and symmetrical. It's becoming more sort of an imbalance factor because of the changing nature of globalization in the present context. You have another example, Michael Froman, who is now in the CFR, who was also the strategist at MasterCard when MasterCard wanted to expand in China, Brazil, and India. He also says that there is more of weaponization taking place. This is the same who was a politician who was appointed by Clinton, a Democrat, and then who went on to explore these career opportunities in business and corporate world. So now, once we look at these inflection points and what keynote speakers said in the morning, we are looking at a global trading system, interestingly, we need to point it out, which is not driven by efficiency, but it is driven by resilience. So most of the countries which are trying to reorient to globalization are not talking about a structural change in the first place, but trying to see that how best they're prepared to give or be prepared to reflect upon it. So instead of saying that we are just in time arrived, what is most important is just in case. So possibilities to avoid volatilities, and these volatilities are going to affect us. That is becoming more sort of central figure into responding to these globalizations. And now what we are looking into more regional plurilateral blocks, which is defragmenting the US-led multilateralism. So you said correctly, actually, it is US, which is actually dictating the terms. Now, if we take that consideration in India's case, and then we put a little bit of a spice here, which is called China, you will see an interesting thing over here. We are an important player in a global supply chain, and you have an API case, we have electronic case. We are importing a lot from China, but we are consuming it, and then we are not able to export it. So the entire processing we are wasting is basically bringing it and composing it. I mean, in automobile sector, especially if you look at the components, and that comes into different things, electronics, gears, you have carbide materials, we are importing from China, but not the finished products. Now let's take an example about carbide products. 100% of carbide products which are used for machine cutting tools, MCM, are being imported by Indian manufacturers, either by Chinese, Japanese, Taiwanese, or by the Germans and the European companies. We have cut down our dependencies on the European companies. Video is one of the fastest growing group in 60s and 70s who provided carbides, but now we're importing the carbides from China. That is last 10 years. And this is not into automobile. This is into the smart design manufacturing, which is even dentist is using, or most of the cutting tools, machine, which is into the other manufacturing territories are using it. So now, if you look at this paradigm, we are into a different segment where we need to, India needs to develop its own manufacturing as well as need to design de-risking. So while designing de-risking, what becomes important for us, for India, is to develop its own ecosystem depth. So the depth of the ecosystem is most important thing. Now let's talk about the non-EV and EV industries. Now, let's take an example of taxation. So maybe this is I'm talking about corporate income tax. Let's not talk about the politicization part of it, incentivized part of it, but CIC is most favorable for the Chinese manufacturers. That's the low-end manufacturers for both the fossil fuel engines and both the EV engines. When it comes to India, the case is different. Apart from that, you take another example, which is on the consumer side. The tax burden on the consumer to buy the vehicle is approximately 50% compared to 28% in China. We pay a lot of taxes to Nirmala Madam when we buy the car. And I give the example actually when we buy a car which is of about 1 liter engine and which is about lesser than 4 meters, we pay less taxes, but the taxes will increase when we buy a car which is about higher than 4 meters and 1.5. If you buy a car which is about 1 liter, which is the turbo, it gives the equal torque which is equal to 1.5. But we do not understand that because there is no nuances been understood by the manufacturer and consumers in India. I don't know whom to blame who, but then I'm trying to provide you the gap between the consumer side and the production side. Let's talk about the ecosystem depth. So essentially, when we come to India's EV sector, and when we see that India significantly depends on China when it comes to the auto component imports, roughly about a quarter to third imports with regard to automobile sector, we are dependent on China. Now, let's talk about 4 important factors which I want to highlight over here. One is, if there is anything India is trying to look as an opportunity in trade war or diversification, it is the automobile sector, which I feel is the India's industrial backbone. Why I'm talking about it? Because over the period of time in last 6 to 7 decades, soon after Maruti came into India, India has developed about 80% of localization, as far as the internal combustion engines are concerned, the old engines are concerned. I tell you the story, when Maruti, Japan wanted to have cooperation create the Maruti, they did not want to have any automation. To cut the cost, Suzuki Maruti wanted to have, no automation. They wanted everything to be assembled by hands. So every industry which is coming to India has their own, intention to use the incremental value India provides it. So when India has created about 80% of the domestic manufacturing, as far as the IC sector is concerned, now we're talking about EVs. So there is a greater threat to kill India's IC manufacturing abilities. So when EVs came, what was the major threat? The larger clusters, industrial clusters, automotive sectors, whether that was Chennai, Pune, Delhi, Gurgaon, they resisted for the EVs because when you talk about EVs, that actually kills the 80% of the manufacturing, because from the nut bolts, screws, and everything is being sidelined. Now in this context, in today's context, that 80% has gone to 95% because you have the 3D machines, right? So that's the major threat. So we're talking about Indian capacities to slowly plug into the larger non-EV sector. We have developed our capacities to replace it, and India aims by 2030 we take that ICE domestic manufacturing, ICE based manufacturing approximately to 85 to 90%. We are being tailspin now, where we see a pressure by the disruption in the supply chains. This is going to get more critical, when we talk about the EV sector. I'm not going to focus on EV sector over here. So when I talk about the major dimensions, of India catapulting or using an opportunity to plug into the global supply chains, and especially we talk about non-EV and EV industries. There are 4 dimensions I want to focus on. One is the value chain maturity. You see that in the non-EV sector, India has the significant maturity as far as localized engines, body, and transmission is concerned. I give you the example of last 7 or 8 years of how anthropologically we developed that idea. I say anthropologically because we didn't catapult it. We couldn't achieve it in 1 or 2 generations, but it took about 2.5 generations, 3 generations. That's there. But when you compare it with the EV, which is an entirely new segment, what the value chain maturity, we are not actually, even, reaching, that colluding stage. What we are into the emerging. We are talking about batteries, we're talking about semiconductors, we're talking about motors. Let's talk about the second dimension, which is the tech orientation. When we talk about the ICE non-EV sector, we are pretty well established as far as mechanical precisions are concerned. When we talk about EV, we are still in a very basic stage when it comes to electric, digital, AI-driven. The cars which are actually logged into the satellites, logged into the automated driven system, which is not there. As far as policy anchors are concerned, with the BS4 norms and ethanol blending, we are at pretty good stage. And if somebody is going to ask, then it is really going to help us or not? It is really going to help us, because over the period of time, we are not only developing the domestic market, but also trying to look at the market where we're going to export these things. The last one is about the export outlook. India must plug into this. It's not old directed, I would say that, but this is definitely transitionally going to help India when it comes to developing markets. EVs, we cannot send EVs to Congo, we cannot sell EVs to Nigeria, right? So the buyers of EVs is already the emerging market, where there is no scope to jostle out anybody. So it is something like you're trying to get into a Bombay local, at about 9:30 when it is already crowded. So it looks like EV market is going to be the latter part for the Indian manufacturing industries. But what is most important for us going forward is to leverage the China factor, leverage the tariff war factor. I just want to conclude in just 2 minutes. Now, so what is the larger economic storyline for us, when it comes to the tariff war? One, everybody knows that, the EV sector is not, if anybody thinks that EV sector is all about climate move, it is not only the climate move. We need to come out of that, because EV sector is all about industrial deepening project. We're trying to add much of finesse to it and much of localization, abilities to that. So with that, if you talk about the larger economic storyline, you would see that the manufacturing multiplier, EV and non-EV, has to be developed simultaneously so that it helps India to multiply the manufacturing abilities. So everyone that that when $1 is put into the output in automobile, it creates about $3.5 of in steel, electronics, and related industries. So the transition has to be intended. Second one is about the energy transformation. So EVs will link manufacturing to renewables. So EVs is not essentially a satellite industry, because it would definitely help or create opportunities when it comes to India's larger automobile narratives are concerned. In a sense, the automobile sector, both traditional and electric, is the template for India's self-reliant industrial modernity. So this idea, sometimes we jump from one narrative to another narrative. Cut the carbon emissions, go for carbon neutral, go for EVs, is not the correct way of interpreting our challenges. Number two, IC manufacturing provides the mass and momentum. We need to understand that. That's the reason, India and China, we both, during our G20 summit, we said that we need to rethink about the carbon mix. Why we need to think about carbon mix is just because if we follow the climate change or the set of emissions which have been put forward or been pressurized and coerced upon us on both countries by the Western countries, is going to kill that mass and momentum of the traditional industries and the expertise which we have developed over the period of few decades. So as a result of it, while EV transition is important, from the perspective of technology and future orientation, the IC manufacturing and developing or controlling the IC manufacturing is also an important thing for India's automobile industries. So together, if you talk about both these industries, EVs and non-EVs industries, they represent India's pivot from assembly-driven growth to innovation-driven sovereignty, and which is the core of 21st century's economic story. I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Anand. Thank you all speakers for those enlightening talks. I will now proceed with a brief summary of the proceedings so far. So Professor Murli, in his talk, discussed data gaps in international trade context. So problems essentially are stemming from the fact that most of the tariff measures, or many, have a non-ad valorem nature of tariff imposition, due to which it is not appropriate to calculate a percentage to measure tariff as a percentage of the value. Hence, that will be a challenge to understand how much your economy is protectionist if you can't measure it as a percentage. Lack of data is another challenge, which is stemming from the idea that services flows between countries do not generally pass through the customs, and hence data on such flows is not accessible to the policymakers. And especially digital flows, of course, we know are difficult to capture across cross-border digital flows, and hence there is some kind of a black hole, data black hole, in terms of whether or how much trade within countries is happening through these service flows vis-a-vis goods and merchandise. The other problem with regard to data collection that Professor Murli has highlighted is with regard to the fact that public data collection or data collection of public agencies has not been contemporaneous, in the sense that it has lagged in time. With the alternative that is emerging, where private sector players are now collecting data, but they charge a fee. Essentially, data has moved from being a public good to a club good, where it is now exclusive. Only for those who pay a price will data be accessible, and that is going to be detrimental for many small players in the economy, like in the agricultural sector. So one question that comes to the mind, which we can discuss during the Q&A session, is whether lack of data on tariffs on services, is it a blessing or a curse, especially in a world where tariffs on goods and merchandise are so conspicuous for policymakers like Trump, so that we get targeted to the extent that we are more successful in doing services trade, maybe by stealth, by not showing what the free trade nature of those services trade are we kind of having a blessing by making them conspicuous, by making them obvious that it's a free trade? Are we inviting trouble by improving data collection? Maybe we can discuss that in the Q&A. Our second speaker, Dr. Rajan Sureshratna, provided a summary of the sectors which are affected by the Trump tariffs, both India as well as China. And his talk examined the strategic implications for both these Asian giants of these reciprocal tariffs. He has then provided insights into India-China trade imbalance and the structural and policy-driven factors contributing to this imbalance. Dr. Ratna has then highlighted the need for enhancing domestic competitiveness by investing in high-value manufacturing. And he has argued that the world has increasingly become unipolar, and it's important for India and China to cooperate in order to make it a more balanced and inclusive global economic order. In his talk, Mr. Santosh Pai has outlined how India's policy stance on economic ties with China has kind of swung from one extreme to the other over time. And he has argued that when thinking about ties with China, there is a need to strike balance between security and economic imperatives. Well, on the one hand, there are genuine concerns about the lopsided nature of trade relations between the two neighbors. There are also opportunities, on the other hand, to boost, say, global share of manufacturing and exports. Mr. Pai's talk has highlighted the lessons to be learned and how we need to bridge the trust gap between the two nations. In the light of tariff and trade restrictions, Professor Arvind's talk has focused on the need for India to develop economic resilience. His talk focused on, instead of just talking about diversification, he has called for prioritizing sectors. In particular, he talked about the automobile sector, the electric vehicle sector. So in the context of discussion about de-risking or decoupling from China, Professor Arvind has stressed on the need to avoid abrupt separation with the economy, especially in the light of the implications it has for other free trade agreements, say with the EU and the Western countries. That's something that we'll come back to when we again do the discussion. Having summarized key points from the talk, I will highlight a couple of key discussion points that emerged to my mind from these talks, and I would then request each of the panel members to provide their inputs on these points. The first question, of course, is with regard to how to engage with China, right? So I wanted to bring to your attention and to the attention of the audience what appears to me as two contrasting views in the policy circles about how to engage with China economically. So on the one hand, we have a statement by the CEO of NITI Aayog, Shri 𝐕𝐵𝐴𝑟 𝐬𝐴𝑟, where he has said, and I quote, "If you're not able to sell in China, it is pointless because it's an $18 trillion economy. You can't avoid that economy," unquote. So in fact, as obvious, he's kind of pitching in or batting for India to engage vigorously with China. Just the previous day, our Honorable Minister of External Affairs, Shri S. Jaishankar, suggested that we should engage less with ASEAN, and the reason being that ASEAN is a conduit for Chinese goods, and these economies are our competitors. Instead, he argued that we should engage with EU and US through free trade agreements. So first question is, of course, are we reading too much into this, or is there a genuine difference of opinion with regard to how to deal with China? If there indeed is, as seems apparent from these contrasting statements, how should policymakers reconcile these two very valid but contrasting viewpoints? So I would now request our panel members to provide their insights on what they think about this.
I think what the CEO of NITI Aayog stated was looking into the facts and data and the report which NITI Aayog did on getting engaged with it. Right? ASEAN, we have a free trade agreement, and India at one point of time in early 2000s was looking at engagement with ASEAN as a strategy. Mm-hmm. So we have Look East policy, then Act East policy, right? In the past decade or so, we have shifted towards more West, which was not there at that moment in time. And our engagement with ASEAN, I can tell you, was also because China was entering into a FTA with ASEAN. At that moment of time, around 1/3 of India's export was to ASEAN, and we thought that if we don't get engaged with ASEAN, we'll be virtually locked out of that market. The concern of ASEAN has been, of course, people can say the Chinese conduit, but the rules of origin are such that the Chinese goods cannot come to India unless it is misdeclared by any of the ASEAN countries. But yes, there are Chinese investment in ASEAN, and they are manufacturing and they can export it to India. But so can happen with Sri Lanka, so can happen with Nepal, so can happen in US.
Sure.
Right? So one should not take that into account. Looking into US or EU, I would say with engagement with China is an economic reality. Because as I showed, you can imagine India's whole pharmaceutical industry might, which is known in the world, is all because of the APIs which are dependent on China, right? Nobody else can supply that. In textile for silk, we investment so much in the domestic sericulture, but all failed, and now the industry is importing all the yarn from China. And there are many other sectors in which this is happening. So there is an economic reality to get engaged directly with China so that you don't fear this ASEAN or circumvention and other things happening. I mean, India is a very typical country, I would say. We get disturbed with many things. I mean, I was in the government when I was handling India-Sri Lanka FTA, India-Nepal FTA. Indian operators went to Sri Lanka for investment for Vanaspati, copper and zinc, and they started exporting to India, and there was all furor and we stopped it. Why Indian investor goes to a neighboring country? Because the cost of manufacturing, because the ease of doing business in India is not that conducive as it is in the neighboring countries. Sri Lanka at one point of time in 2000 was much more better emerging country than India or any other South Asian countries at that moment of time. But that was the case, and same thing happened with Nepal. But if you look at a geopolitical strategy, because it was told in the morning in the opening session, over-dependence on one country is not good. So you need to have a balance. And definitely in the world, US can be balanced by China, China can be balanced by US and Europe. India has not reached at that moment, that level where it can become a triangle of this polar world, right? You have might, you have everything else, but economically, we are, yes, one of the top 5 economies in the world, but also not in terms of export. It's also because we have 1.4 billion population here. And that is a very big market which everybody in the world is looking at. And that is our power, right? So getting engaged with US, getting engaged with EU, as was said by Arvind also, you have many things which is going beyond normal traditional goods. Defense supplies, strategic alliances, technology. We were hearing in the morning, the China has done so much reverse technology and it has adopted it to its own. And now it has setting global standards in technology, EVs and solar cells and other things. We are far, far behind. So we need to, so I don't see that two wings of the government are in conflict with each other, but one is stating on the report which looked into an analysis and said, and another is giving you a political direction in which India is looking at.
Let me also add to it, because when we are sitting and analyzing FTAs, which is good and which is bad, we are also looking at, how the world has moved from efficiency-seeking value chains to compliance-seeking value chains. Okay, so what happens is, tomorrow's world is all about compliance-seeking value chains. So when we are signing an agreement, Jaishankar's argument will be big. When we are signing an agreement with the UK, EU, let's leave out US for the time being because it's yet to be seen where the US FTA will take us. So what we would be negotiating there is in terms of an agreement between the two countries in terms of MRs, mutual recognition. Okay, so I don't know how it will shape up, but I think broadly we'll be looking at that sort of a direction which India would be taking. And it's all positive once we sign an agreement in terms of mutual recognition agreement, because there's a lot of the CBAM, it's impacting our steel, aluminium, and it will also impact energy, cement, and many other things in the future. And then you also have this waste shipment regulation which has come up, which actually blocks any export of waste from European Union to any other country. If it is green, declared as green, then if it is declared as amber, then it will be deciding which country complies with, again, manufacturing facilities in line with the EU understanding of environment protection, so-called environment protection, which I feel, is not legit protection, which they are asking. EU is harping upon excessive environmental protection, which is going overboard. So there is a conflict between the bureaucrats in EU and the politicians. If you read the undercurrents, very clear conflict is there because the bureaucrats in the EU, Brussels, sitting in Brussels, are going overboard with respect to environment protection and only fighting carbon, CO2, leaving out the other greenhouse gases, because we know the politics of greenhouse gases. There's methane, which actually developed countries consume, then you know the dynamics. So what we are looking at is, in terms of a EU agreement, which will shape up, which we can mold. Okay, and the other part is, what as Professor Rajan has already mentioned, with respect to the rules of origin, it is only valid after import comes into, and when the duty is exchanged. You get a duty concession after your goods are accepted. So it's a, and again the data there's again an issue of data, because at least when your goods comes into the market, it pays the duty. But when it is accepted, you don't know what is the gap between when it is accepted, because the communication between two countries. Of course, today everything has become E. But again, this acceptance is still customs free.
So Karthikeya, I think the question doesn't really stop saying, what the Indian government thinks, because there is a lot of relativity. What happens here is that how India should deal with China is not only in the hands of Indian administrators or government. Now the things have turned so complex that EU is affecting, expecting, and have certain level of expectations from the Indian government how it should treat or how it should deal with China, because we are a part of a system and a global wiring. Let me borrow the word from the title of the conference. We are part of it. I'll give you an example. In past seven decades, Europe has lost a lot of industries to Chinese. Okay, so it is not India is only talking to China buying this product, but also Europe has lost those industries to China. So essentially, what we are buying from Europe is also the Chinese companies which are in Europe. So the question of this, equilateral questionability of this trade and tariff needs to be brought into consideration. I give you an example of, I remember, a lot of heavy industry technicians used to travel to Germany for those mixers. Those mixers are now being bought by the Chinese companies. Heavy lifting, verticals, which the most of the developers will use in India. Those are being manufactured by the Chinese sitting in Europe. So we have lost that market already. We were buying these aero bridges. CMCC produces this thing actually. Those are by the Chinese. So this is not only what Indian government wants to buy and what should be the conditions of buying and trading with the Chinese, but we have wired ourselves in so complex way. I'll give you an example. A few years back when the metro for phase 3 metro, Mumbai Metro did the tendering, and the tender was won by L&T, and L&T subtendered it for the TBMs, tunnel boring machines, and these machines were bought by Australia, but the Australia bought this machine from the Chinese. So we are widening us in such a system. I question myself, do we have, that autonomy to discuss, how much I can pressurize? Diva is smiling there, if not, yes. How much autonomy we have to tell Chinese that, hey, stop, we do not want to do it? I give example of the automobile industries. The Europeans want us to slowly de-risk with the Chinese because they want us to slowly de-risk and develop the ability so that we plug it into the larger supply chain and then we can take it over. No, let's talk about the electronic supplies and the capacities the world is looking for. There is a $500 billion of market. How much capacity we have? Hardly 5%. Okay, if we want to really plug into that, we need to develop the capacities. And if we say that I give you the simple statistics, as far as the automobile components are concerned, year to year, we have reduced our imports from 30% to 27% year on year, 23, 24 to 24, 25. But actually, most of these components, electric circuit boards, are coming from Vietnam. And if you look at the incorporation of the Chinese components in Vietnam, that has spiked up. So this question becomes pretty interesting, when we try to understand, you know how to play the lawn tennis, but it is important whether it's a grass court, clay court, okay, it's a synthetic court.
So, I would like to just say that these two views within the government they're neither mutually contradictory, nor are they mutually exclusive of each other. I think they're both parts of the same kind of strategy which we have to design. Proactively, we need to work more with like-minded countries from a long-term perspective to promote our national interest. And in the short term, whatever dependencies we have with unhappy neighbors, we have to deal with it. So I would just say that we need to raise our ambition in terms of national goals and not get stymied because we have a China problem or a China conundrum. We shouldn't scale down our ambitions because of that, because it's challenging, it's not easy, but every country in the world is dealing with that challenge. And we have actually been dealt a good hand, I would say, because the whole world looks at us as a democracy, respects rule of law, we have a big domestic market which we can leverage. So we have a lot of good cards, but currently we're in a state of flux. There is no consensus within the government, and with our Chinese interlocutors also we can't find common ground because of what I said, last 5 years there's been a statement. So we need to start engagement and figure this out. And a good starting point, a safe starting point, is just to articulate what our red lines are, what our priorities are. Because even that sometimes is lacking. If you ask someone, what are the sectors in which you don't want Chinese activity, economic interference or whatever, there's no clarity, right? So that puts a kind of cloud on European businesses, American businesses, Indian businesses making any kind of a business plan, and that in 10 years, 20 years will count for a lot. So I think from a policy making perspective, if you offer clarity, a lot of these problems might get resolved. Because Indian companies know very well what they're dependent on China for. So the minute they're given clarity, they will themselves get rid of those dependencies. No one is willing to continue with this state of affairs. But the policy paralysis or lack of clarity or cohesion, I would say, because each part of the government is very clear on what they're aiming at, but to put it together and what we call a whole of government approach, that is the clarity that's missing, and that's partly because it also needs to come from the Chinese side. It will come through engagement. It cannot come in a vacuum. We cannot sit in Delhi or Indore and figure out it. It has to come through interactions, iterations to test various hypotheses and figure it out. So, I mean, that's where I stand. It's not a Twitter kind of short response, but it's highly nuanced, it's highly complex.
Yeah.
There are too many variables, but we have to walk that difficult path. We cannot say that, we will just stick with status quo, because status quo is favoring China big time. Our dependency is growing and they're quite happy in this situation. There's no incentive, I think, no Chinese companies now fighting to invest in India. So it's all uphill for us.
Right. So let me follow up on that point about India having a leverage of a large market. Now, what we all recognize is that Indian companies need to improve their competitiveness. And what we know from the Chinese experience is that they've used their large market as leverage to engage in what is called in literature as a quid pro quo FDI. So for students in the audience, quid pro quo FDI is the idea that Chinese would allow market access only if the foreign company, Western company, also provides them with access to technology. So can India use its large market as leverage? Can India do a China to West and to China themselves? So we did it. There was mention of automobile sector. We did it with Suzuki, right? Can we do it with BYD, right? So what is the option that Indian policymakers or businesses have in terms of leverage, in terms of coming up with something like a quid pro quo kind of an idea?
See, India cannot do that as a policy, to be very honest. Mm-hmm. The revolution in automobile industry in India happened in 1998, DGFT policy, which was formulated in August, which forced companies to come for the investment with localization within 5-year time frame and export obligation, and both of them were violative of claims of the WTO.
But WTO is no longer.
We lost, but by then, because we had a time frame from 1999 till 2005 to liberalize our quantitative restrictions. So the automobile industry had to take a call to wait for liberalization of quantitative restrictions or invest, and they invested. We lost the dispute, but by then the things were there in place and we knew that we are going to lose the dispute. But sometimes you come out with a policy with the intention because it gives you a 3 to 4 year cushion. Like US in the Trump first regime put those duties on China knowing fully well that the security exceptions invoking is against the WTO provision, and the WTO jurisprudence said that you are wrong, but still they got a 4-year, 5-year time to get away with it, and they penalized China. Now what happens in China and what cannot happen in India? China cannot have any rule, but one man says this is the rule and everybody down below will apply to it. This doesn't happen in India. India still is a democratic and a rule-based system. So any government official, in order to implicate or do this kind of activity, requires a law or a policy. And the day you come with this policy, it will be a violative of TRIM, so you cannot do it today. Right. I will give you one example. I remember I was in India ASEAN economic ministers meeting, and our minister that time was Mr. Morosogi Maran. And we were meeting with Japan minister bilateral at that moment of time, and the Japanese minister was all complaint against China. He said, and they were interested in having FTA with India at that moment of time. I'm talking about 2000, 2001. We did start a dialogue with Japan. And what the minister said, that we have a lot of investment in China, but unfortunately these companies which are making profit, the Chinese government is not allowing the repatriation back to Japan, but it is forcing to reinvest. And when we talk with the government, they say, no, there is no embargo. The industry goes to the bank says, yes, you can do it, but they will not transfer the money. So they were held up, and he was saying, we are so much suffocated and throttled by China that we want to look for a green pasture which is more transparent. That is how we got engaged with Japan, and it's known how investment from Japan has come. So in China, the rule may be something else, but the rule of the game which you play could be entirely different. In India, I don't think that could happen. You can do it for 2 years, 3 years, possible.
We don't have the luxury, sir. We don't have the luxury. See, another dimension is, when we are offering the market access, who are they competing with us? They'll be competing with Mahindra and Tata's, which actually directly manufacturing electric vehicles. The other dimension is that, electric vehicle is still under the suspicion, because they are hugely having electric batteries beyond, so they radiate, and there is some sort of a health impact. So there are these concerns which are raised with respect to traveling in an EV. It causes you headache, it causes nausea, then just various things which we associate. It may be psychological for many consumers, but it is yet under the umbrella of suspicion. That said, the BYD can never enter Indian market because this dimension of it directly competing with the Mahindra and Tata's is there. Look at the Maruti strategy. What they've done. Have they brought out complete EV? No. They only have hybrid. Why did they do it? They're still suspicious about the technology.
Yeah, I would like to differ with respect. I think the utopian world where rule of law is respected has been thrown out of the window. And if no one is playing by the rules, why as Indians we should scale down our ambitions and play by the rules? So I slightly differ. Although being a lawyer, I think from a practical perspective, we are doing industrial policy. We are giving incentives, production linked incentives. We are admitting in a way that manufacturing is not profitable in India. And that's why we are giving incentives, because that's an admission. I mean, let's not split hairs. So I would say if we have the ambition, we will find the means. And especially with Chinese companies who have seen what China has done to foreign companies, some of them will be even compliant. They'll say, okay, name the price. How much localization do you want? What is it that you want? Just let us operate, right? So, I mean, not all, I don't want to take names and generalize, but there will be players who will be amenable, because India is a large market. If you get even 2% market share today, which can grow to 20% in next 10, 15 years, it's attractive. So these rules of the game, it's I think they all know, but they're not admitting, but they can be tweaked to get national objectives. And this is not it's not an underhanded game. We are giving incentives. So once we give incentives, we can set up localization targets. In fact, I would argue that if you go back to 1991, if some of this had been done with more rigorousness and localization was enforced at a faster rate, we would be in a better situation. So even today, for next investment coming in from tomorrow, if we start enforcing localization through whatever means, non-tariff barriers, industrial policy measures, or just economic diplomacy, by convincing the companies that you localize more, we are like-minded countries, or whatever it takes. So I would say that we can, I think, work between the rules, or between the sort of. I mean, we just have to play the game that the rest of the world is playing. We can't.
Linked incentives, because the companies had to fulfill certain percentage. In the early stage of development of the EV industry in China during 2000s, China was also providing subsidy other than the different measures taken to boom their or make up their EV industry. But at the same time, China has recently filed a WTO complaint against India, specifically 3 PLIs, saying that it violates competition. So, two questions. So we have already started doing that. What more can we do, that is towards Santosh sir? And towards Rajan sir, I just wanted to ask, like in the case of automobile, the example that you gave from 1999, so you said that we knew that we are going to lose. Will that be the same fate for this complaint, or where do we stand?
Can you correct a few questions and then we'll take it? Yeah. Sir.
I wanted to offer a few comments, if you permit. One, we need to be clear about certain facts that when it comes to trade relations with China, it's not a case of interdependence. It's a case of one-sided dependency. The reference was made to India's position in China's supply chain, though at lower end. In case of imports, that's not the case, because the total imports from India last year, $18 million. I looked up figures for H1 2025. It's still just less than $9 billion. It's not something which is going to hurt them. Whereas our dependencies, as you know, Santosh and others brought out, is actually increasing. This year, in Q1, Q2, our exports, our trade deficit with China have increased by $8 billion. So we are looking at the present trends continue, total trade deficit of about $115 billion with China. And we are unable to reduce dependencies in critical areas. That's one. Second, I'll fully endorse Santosh's point that China is comfortable with the status quo. They talk about lack of level playing field, but actually in practice they don't feel particularly constrained. They're not interested in investing in India at this point of time, except in a limited way through JV route, which is not particularly sort of attractive. So while we can talk in terms of dialogue with China, I've been part of those discussions for a very long time, they don't yield any outcomes. And so we should not be holding our breath. Our strategy will have to be developed on our own. China did not consult USA before developing its counter strategy. We don't need to consult China on what needs to be done. And now, two questions you raised. Is there sort of split thinking within government? Yes, there is split thinking within government of India. This was clear in economic survey of last year, which was questioned by many of us because we felt that it's based on naive assessments. And in fact, this year there's course correction in economic survey also. But we are actually moving to other extreme, saying that our engagement with East has not yielded adequate dividends. Let's look at the West. Problem is that what is West? USA, you are aware what's happening. EU, you look at the track record. Range of goods, whether it's CBAMs, whether it's EU deforestation, free product regulation, non-tariff barriers which are there. In what way we are looking at EU as more law-abiding, rule-based trading arrangement? So it's a difficult situation. De-risking we have no alternative. We have to do de-risking because one thing we must be clear that China is systematically weaponizing dependencies, systematically, and it's doing in a manner which exceeds USA. In fact, if you look at its future projections, especially what they announced on 9th October. Here, Santosh, your point, HS-85. HS-85 also, we have made some dent. Solar modules come under HS-85. This requires hard decisions. What we did, hard stop, no import of solar panels from China. And in parallel, we are developing capabilities. In solar modules and cells, last year actually we had something like 65 gigawatt worth of capability. Moving on to wafers and ingots, polysilicon, it's a roadmap. We'll have to. It's not. It will be protracted. It will be difficult. So we'll have to find answers specific sector by sector. And Sudesh, I'm afraid. Any thinking that more trade leads to less conflict is not borne by any empirical data. We can discuss that. Look at China, Japan, kind of dependencies there, and kind of look at their relations. That doesn't happen. Also, being constrained by WTO. Why should we be constrained by WTO? The rest of the world is not constrained by WTO, so we do whatever is required. And Indians in government of India can be as cassette as government of India, government of China. Let me tell you, someone who worked in government of India for 38 years plus. So we'll find when you want to. We banned apps from China overnight. USA is struggling. TikTok, it took them ages. So we can take hard decisions. Frankly, need is for us to have clarity on our objectives. This is where we want to reach. Willingness to pay a price. Because if we don't pay this price, we'll pay a much bigger price down the road. Because China is going to hurt us. I have no doubt about it. These are more comments than questions, but anyone wishes to...
Yeah. Unfortunately, we don't have time for any more questions, so we'll take the panel to respond to your questions. And then, of course, during tea, you can always...
I'll answer to her. What Santosh said, or what Ambassador said, you require a will, right, to knowingly violate any international obligation. So far, India has not done. And there are many countries, including US, who have not adhered to the international obligations they have violated. So far, India has not done. It may do, it has to do consciously. Coming to your point when you are talking about the auto policy and others, even now, India can take a policy measure, like even when you are saying, can we do that? We can do that. Nothing prevents of doing that. But we do not want to do that as a policy maker or the government. So far it has not taken. Tomorrow it may happen. Because consciously we do not want to be embarrassed at a multilateral platform. US doesn't bother about it. So if you see the disputes in the WTO, half of the disputes are against US. They have not learned the lesson. US, even despite losing the dispute to Brazil on BT cotton, went for a compensation but did not abide by the appellate tribunal's order. It said, I will not. We, even just a panel decision comes and we change our policy. Very seldom we have to go to, the appellate body. Now, even today, like China has taken us for a dispute. Yes, it has taken us for a dispute. What will happen? 3 years it will take for the panel to come out with finding. And if I am strategic, I will file an appeal for an appellate body. There is no appellate body in the WTO. There won't be any appellate body for 5 years. I can continue penalizing for 10 years any country I want to. That's what US is doing. I mean, yeah, but that's what I'm saying. We can do.
We are doing it.
So far, sir, we have not, to be very honest.
Please tell me one case in recent past where we have been constrained. There is no appellate body available.
In the 5 years, we have not come out with any policy, to be very honest, which can be blatantly or glaringly violating the WTO commitments of India. You talk banning the Chinese.
I think we don't even have to go that far. The PLI itself is ownership neutral.
Exactly.
Ownership neutral. So whether you are a foreign company or an Indian company, the PLI says nothing about ownership. It says you invest in India, you produce, and then you. So that's what it says.
Even WTO's co-controls.
Just one quick response to her question. I think the federal structure in India is designed in such a way that the central government actually doesn't have too many levers. They do have some levers, like PLI is a good example. But that's not the same with the states. States today compete with each other to get FDI, and there's a lot of negotiation of package of incentives that happens. And nothing is preventing those at that stage to stipulate how much of localization targets they should hit. It's like business planning. It's not that I will chase you out of the country if you don't meet those targets, but it's an incentive plan that rolls out over 5 years. We have done it for a number of contract manufacturers. Some states have done it. In fact, now one state is borrowing funds from, financing it to repay the incentives promised to the investors. So these are the other levers. It may not be the central government. It doesn't mean flouting laws or norms. There are positive incentives that can be given, but the fact is that localization can be done, could have been done much better, but now it's better late than never.
So Satoshi, I have to correct you on that, because increasingly under the new FDAs which we are signing, the sub-federal level regulations are also brought in.
Yes.
So commitments, they are seeking our acceptance to bring in the commitments onto them also. So what is happening is, the world today has realized that, at sub-federal level we may have different way of treating. So that's been out there, so we have to be careful about that.
No, there is a tension there. There will always remain a tension. But I was just saying that this is the challenging environment. We have to cope with it.
Unfortunately, I know there are several hands which I have raised, but the convener has already said time up. So I have to stop here. Thank you so much, all the speakers and the audience, for your engagement.
That was a wonderful session, and it's always good to have differences of opinion to light up the atmosphere. Please may I request CEO is gone. Okay, then let me do the honors. So, please, we would like to now give mementos to our distinguished panelists. So let's get started.
Next to Rajan sir. Next to Santosh sir. And to the co-convenor 𝐓𝐚𝐵 sir. Thank you for being patient. We are running a little late, but the next session will start at 6:15 sharp.
Yeah, and the unfortunate news is to facilitate early dinner, we are not having tea now. Once we have tea, then our dinner will get delayed. So the choice between tea and dinner, let's go for dinner. So 6:15 we get started sharp, and then we move. After the session, obviously. It's just a 10-minute break after the heavy bombardment of the economists.